Hi, my name is James Andriella, and you're listening to the Back to Human podcast. On the show with me today, I'm joined by John Geisheker, the director and the general counselor for Doctors Opposing Circumcision. As you could probably guess, we will be talking about circumcision, and I want to preface this episode by saying that if you're tuning in and you're hoping for both sides of the story, this episode is not for you. I'm personally biased as I have two sons, two young boys that we've chose to forego the circumcision, despite me personally being circumcised myself. And I didn't really research this topic too much at all. I just felt intuitively that this didn't make a whole lot of sense to me. I don't believe that we are born with mistakes. I believe that we should, if there is a piece of your body on you, then it likely serves a purpose. However, John today has plenty of experience. He has done the research, and we will be diving into why exactly he opposes circumcision. Without further ado, John, welcome to the show, brother.
Hey, thank you, James. Is James okay?
Yeah, that's fine. Yes, please. Keep it simple. I'm a simple man. So, John, would you take me into why this issue became important to you personally, and when did you start doing your own research? What led to pulling back the curtain for you?
Well, without getting too histrionic about it, my story goes back to when I was 50, which is 30 years ago. I was teaching sailing on Lake Superior, which is a second career for me. I work as a captain, and I also work as a maritime lawyer. And one of my colleagues, another sailing instructor, mentioned his wife was pregnant, and he asked me what I thought about circumcision. And at that point, I had no expertise whatsoever. And so I just giggled about it and said, "Oh, why don't you just save the money and give it to him when he's 18, he'll buy a car with it." And the guy laughed, and we parted ways. And the next time I saw him, his boy had been born, and he said he had him circumcised. And I just went into this decline. I was deeply, deeply embittered, just as an attorney would be who had missed a filing date on a capital case. I mean, I just was troubled by it day and night and day and night. So I went to see my mother, and she said, "Well, perhaps you've forgotten your story." And she reminded me that I came to the United States as an immigrant in 1951. I was 5 years old, and I had been left intact at birth. This was in New Zealand, which actually has a very interesting history on circumcision. So I was unfortunately taken to the doctor, not for circumcision, but just for some routine checkup or something. And I was circumcised right on the spot, tied down onto a gurney. And my mother was ordered from the room, and she listened to me scream for 45 minutes. And then when I came home circumcised, I hid under the bed for 3 days and refused food and adults, and basically, I don't know, was traumatized. So
And
I
this was 5 years old.
walked out. I eventually walked out. This is 1951. Never mentioned it again. I have an intact brother with whom I shared a room. I know that he taunted me a bit, but I put it away. And I ran into George Denniston about that same time at a conference in Washington, D.C. George Denniston was the founding president of Doctors Opposing Circumcision and a former medical professor at the University of Washington School of Medicine here in Seattle. And he and his colleagues told a great story, and I needed some therapy on the issue at the time. So I joined DOC, and that was more than 25 years ago, and I've been the director ever since. So yeah, I was sort of compelled into it. I should mention that, I mean, I did mention I'm from New Zealand, but New Zealand has an interesting history in that their circumcision rate probably went to 98% in the 1950s, but it dropped to zero in about the mid-1960s when they decided it was a British invention they didn't care for, and the government wouldn't pay for it. So, I mean, they just literally stopped like on a Thursday and haven't done a circumcision since. And in fact, I'm headed to New Zealand in a couple months, and I know I will feel much relieved when I step onto the tarmac at Auckland Airport and I know that the boys are all intact. It's very, very nice. Anyway, you might want to know what DOC does. I mean, we're an informational organization, mostly, but I do a fair number of tasks, a list here. We assist families whose boy was forcibly retracted, a very common injury. I handle at least 100 of these a year, and I've handled 1,800 so far. We assist men who are distressed by their circumcision to get counseling, and we counsel them as best we can, although I'm not a trained counselor. We deal with spite circumcisions. That is where a couple breaks up, they didn't circumcise their child at birth, and now one of them decides he wants to do it. And usually it's done to spite the other partner. Um, and these are ugly cases. I hate them, and they're distressing, and they're distressing for all parties, actually. I also help men who want to restore their foreskin non-surgically, and your viewers may be surprised to learn you can do that, but you can. It's very effective. It's very cheap. It's not fast. It takes about 3 years, but it's painless. And hundreds of thousands of men are now doing that. They don't, of course, toot their horn on the issue very much because it bucks the culture, as you can imagine, and might prove unpopular. But I advise them all the time, and I've seen men who've done terrific handiwork. There's a little essay on the doc website about it's an encouragement to men who are distressed with being circumcised, to encourage them to do non-surgical restoration, which is merely a gentle tension of about maybe a pound, maybe a kilo of tension on the existing penile skin to encourage it to grow. I mean, one of the reasons that very, very obese people get a lot of skin is the interior pressure of their adipose, their fat tissue, pushes against their skin, which encourages the skin to grow. And so that same technique will restore
Mm.
your foreskin. By the way, that technique is over 2,000 years old. In the Hellenic period, when Jews were living in Greece and in Rome, um, they wanted to pull their skin over the top of their glands because in Roman and Greek culture, showing the glands was considered sexually provocative, but you could be seen naked. In fact, the original Olympics were played in the nude, as some of your viewers might know.
Mm.
Anyway, I also deal with attorneys who are engaged in circumcision litigation, despite circumcisions maybe, but also uh, other sorts of activities, usually involving a botch or an injury to a child.
Mm.
And um, yeah, and I help people find a foreskin-friendly provider, and they're short on the ground. I mean,
Mm.
most American doctors are predisposed to consider circumcision a favor to the child and a favor to the family, not realizing, of course, it's rather tawdry history.
Mm.
Um,
And so you have a pretty traumatic experience. You said you were 5 years old. Um,
right.
I recall because I was adopted myself, and then shortly after being circumcised, I just think back to when I was such a baby and just helpless. I couldn't fend for myself. That this would probably not be something that I would personally choose myself. It's like my autonomy was just entirely removed. Someone made a decision for me, despite me not being able to make one. And you said that you have adults that are coming to you because they're distressed based off their circumcision. So what exactly is there? What are they dealing with? Perhaps subconsciously because this stuff gets buried. Like how much are you remembering from when you were a child or a baby?
Well, I remember nothing of it because I packed it away, and George Denniston teased me, the president of DOC teased me that I should get counseling for that, and I said, "George, I was a very smart 5-year-old. I packed that memory away, and I have no interest in poking around in there and getting out and dealing with it because I don't think it can actually be dealt with as I think about it." Let me tell you, the reason men come to me is they go through what we call the obsessive epiphany, and it takes a certain format. They eventually one day look at their scar and realize, what was there before I had that scar? How did I function? And I think many men get to this when in their 40s or 50s, they begin to find they don't have quite enough sexual sensation to function, and they question why that happened. So then these days with the internet, of course, you can go online at night and just make yourself nauseous with videos of circumcisions, comments about circumcisions, miscomments and misinformation about how anatomy works. And these guys eventually get themselves pretty well worked up. I mean, I understand it having been worked up myself. And they contact me often in tears and they want to know what to do. And my advice is usually the non-surgical foreskin restoration methods and maybe getting involved in the movement against circumcision so we can make the U.S. eventually like my native New Zealand, where circumcision is unavailable.
Mm. Is it illegal there, or is it just not really an
No,
accepted practice at all?
you know, I don't think it's illegal. But what happened is that a doctor might get reprimanded by the government for performing a circumcision on a boy that's healthy. I mean, obviously, a urologic surgeon in New Zealand would be allowed to do a circumcision if there were some terrible problem with the man's foreskin, cancer, or a very bad case of what's called balanitis xerotica
Mm.
obliterans, one of those reasons. But it would be inappropriate to do that to a healthy newborn child, and so the custom has died. Years and years ago in the 60s, when doctors were approached by parents, the doctors would simply say, we don't do that anymore. It doesn't have a medical purpose. And that worked. A couple
Mhm.
generations later, it's basically disappeared there. It could disappear here if we had the same sort of history.
So they're ahead of the game over there. And what I would
Yeah,
say is, if there's no medical purpose, why is it still a practice over here?
money.
What's the
And
misconception?
it's a $6 billion industry. And let me give your viewers a quick little run through this. People think of circumcision as sexually neutral, that it just is a different looking penis that has a slightly different function. But that's not its history. It was invented specifically to desensitize a man's penis to make it less attractive for him to goop with. And it's based on a rather interesting little medical theory. Before we discovered germs, physicians thrashed around trying to think of what possibly could be the cause of diseases. And they came up with this weird theory called reflex neurosis. And reflex neurosis theory says that if you touch a sensitive part of your body, like the genitalia, you will cause disease to spring up elsewhere, say tuberculosis. That was a very common one. And tuberculosis was a terrible scourge in the 19th century. There was no cure for it, and it was a steady downhill slope. I mean, the the literature is full of people who were famous authors, famous politicians, or whatever, who contracted tuberculosis, and their life became miserable after that. And so, with this theory that if you touch your genitalia, you get tuberculosis, doctors decided to impose circumcision as a way to prevent people from being attracted to touching themselves. And of course, babies, children, toddlers all do so anyway. But if you could make the penis less sensitive, uh, um, I will mention that, I know that intact men, for instance, can masturbate by simply rolling their foreskin between their fingers, using that movement we know to imitate money,
Mm.
the old symbol for money, because this foreskin is so terribly sensitive. And the 19th century physicians knew that. That was their target. Their target was an area called the frenulum delta. It's a part of the penis on the bottom side that strings down from the urethra in a little tiny thing called the frenulum, and then spreads out into circles that encircle the penis. Because if you think about it, the sensible way, if you had to design penis from the start, would be to design it with exactly what it has right now, which is an erogenous zone that unfolds when needed, but can be put away and kept moist and live when it isn't. So it's an ingenious design. Also, an intact man, when he's aroused, produces his own fluid, the fluid called, it used to be called Cowper's fluid. Now it's called penile urethral gland fluid. And that fluid completely fills the space between the foreskin and the glands so that the penis is wet and ready for um, insertion. And that's itself an ingenious design. The glans, on the other hand, is basically just a pillow at the end of the cavernosa, the cylinders inside the penis that fill with blood to give it its rigid quality. And the glans doesn't have much in the way of sensation except at the corona and what's left of the frenulum delta, or what's left of the frenulum. And so a circumcised man has a remarkably low amount of his birth sexual sensation. We estimate the loss at about 75%. Now, one quick theory is that maybe men have 400 times more sensation than they need to function. And that would make sense. I mean, I think nature's idea was that a penis would be ready to go quickly, would be um, would be inclined to penetrate deeply, folding back the because a shallow penetration might not be as successful for reproduction, right? Historically,
Mhm.
we're talking about thousands of years. And so a deeper penetration might be more effective. So the design of the penis as nature designed it seems to me rather marvelous. I mean, I have some engineering training and I would be very proud of that design had I come up with it. But what the doctors in the 19th century did was they were determined to take out the most sensitive parts of the penis. And that theory, that entire anatomical theory, has been deeply squelched by American medical scholars. I mean, you can't get a PhD doing a study on penile sensitivity because everybody knows that circumcision is terrific and fine and everybody should have it. And so, I mean, 70 million American men. I'm just astonished when I think historically about this because 70 million American men will never actually know what sex feels like. They'll
Mhm.
feel a facsimile of it when they're younger, but eventually they'll be in their 60s, 70s, and 80s, and they'll regularly misfire because they simply don't have the sexual sensation. And anyone within the sound of my voice right now, any male, can test his glands by touching it and realizing it can barely detect hot from cold. It actually doesn't like being touched very much. Most of the sensations it sends back to you are unpleasant ones. And the only part of it that really has any sensation is at the widest part, the corona. And that sensation isn't very strong. So, yeah, I think it's awful what medical science has done to men. Because remember, this was once a punishment. It was a punishment to stop you from touching yourself so you wouldn't get tuberculosis. And you can, and by the way, about 100 other diseases. So what I'm old enough, I'll be 80 in a couple months. And I'm just old enough to remember when in the 1950s, doctors were very proud of the fact that they were detuning or desensitizing boys because that would save them from masturbation, which even in the 1950s was considered a tremendous curse and a drain on the body's energy and a psychological problem for the boy himself. And so they thought they were doing people a favor. Well, what happened, and I know this history well, is coming into the 1960s when there was a cultural revolution in the US, which suggested that people are entitled to their sexual sensation, then suddenly the marketing of circumcision changed steps, and it was declared that it was sexually neutral, had no effect on sexual performance whatsoever. And they've stuck with that. And almost all the medical books I run into, especially English language ones, say that the glans is the seat of male sensation. And as long as you have a glans, you're in perfectly good shape. And of course, the legal cases even track that. I mean, boys who have lost their entire glans are entitled to millions and millions of dollars in reparations because of the surgical botch. Yeah, but the marketing continues. I've often said in lectures that if I were a professor of marketing at a business school teaching MBA students, I would assign them the marketing that the American medical community did for circumcision starting in the 1870s, because it's an interesting history of twists and turns. And anytime there was a criticism, they would answer it. Then they would advance weird theories like boys needed to see boys just like them. And children are always comparing their penises and seeing who got what. And I mean, all of this stuff is marvelous material for. So, I mean, there's a great movie actually. I'm trying to think of it. It's about Kellogg, John Harvey Kellogg, who's the brother of the man who invented cornflakes in Battle Creek, Michigan. And there's a movie about him starring Anthony Hopkins. Oh, it's something about wellness. I forgot. But if you if your viewers want, that's a great, great movie. Look at Anthony Hopkins as John Harvey Kellogg, who, by the way, believed circumcision should always be painful to send a message to the boy that his penis was serious business and it shouldn't be goofed with. And this was his first early message that pain and sex are deeply entwined. So yeah, that's the sort of work I do. I mean, lectures and chatting with men and chatting with unhappy people. I just got a message yesterday from somebody who speaks English as a second language. He sent it to me as an AI essay, and it's about
Mhm.
his bitterness about the fact that his son had an undescended testicle, so he took him in for surgery, and the doctor said, "Oh, well, we'll go from around here. Why don't we circumcise your boy?" And he casually said, "Yes." and now
Mhm.
deeply, deeply regrets it and feels very, very bitter about what happened to him and to his boy, probably because he speaks English as a second language and got taken advantage of. That used to be common, by the way. It used to be common that if a boy went in for a tonsillectomy and he wasn't circumcised, they would offer to do both at the same time under the same anesthesia. And so there are millions of American men, the story of waking up from the anesthesia of a tonsillectomy, it painful enough, only to discover they also had a wounded penis into the bargain. Prior to that even, doctors didn't even ask parents. I mean, I have brothers-in-law and, my wife's late parents who said that in the 1950s, they weren't even asked. The boys were just lined up on a workbench in a hospital, and everyone operated on regardless of what the parents wanted. And interestingly enough, the people who really complained the most bitterly were Jews who wanted their boy circumcised on the 8th day. And one of the reasons we have informed consent today is they pushed the idea that doctors should ask when they were going to perform surgery on children. And that's it's wonderfully ironic that the Jews, who are famously connected with at least ritual circumcision, were the ones who pushed informed consent.
Mm. So you said that Dr. Kellogg, or I don't know if it was a doctor, but Kellogg, he wanted to be painful as a punishment. And as soon as you
Right.
said that circumcised men have 75% approximately less sensation, it just
Correct.
seems like it's mutilation, like it's very intentful mutilation, and it doesn't really provide any of the health benefits that it's supposedly
I
supposed
mean, you
to
can
help you from, or like cleanliness and such.
cleanliness was a big one. Part of the marketing that I mentioned of circumcision was the demonization of the foreskin as a body part. It was deemed to be a cesspool of exotic diseases, and it needed to be cleaned early, and you needed to train the boy to clean himself early. And certainly circumcision would be better than having to do all that cleaning. So one of the ways circumcision was marketed to mothers especially was, do you really want to be pulling back your boy's foreskin in the bath, twice a week for until he's like 6 or 7 years old? I mean, it's kind of yucky. It's got some bad social constructs about child abuse. So why don't we just circumcise and be so much easier for you? You'll create a non a low maintenance penis as a result. And of course, lots of young parents sucker for that, especially if the man is circumcised and doesn't feel any harm in it because he doesn't know what he's lost. He doesn't know what he could have had.
So, what information are the parents being given in the hospital? They're just told that it's for the cleanliness, as stated.
I guess
Just
the
not
whole
given anything.
panoply of historical explanations is available to anybody in medicine who's trying to convince parents. But one of the sneakiest ways they do it is they just put it on a form and you're busy signing away and you accidentally sign a circumcision form. And parents are never told, for instance, how little blood it takes to kill an infant. I'll give you the quick calculus because I've handled 4 death cases. Um, a child who weighs 8 pounds, 4 kilos, 8 pounds, 8.5 pounds, 4 kilos, has 12 ounces of blood. That's about a coffee cup and a half, right? 12 ounces. The loss of 20% of that, or 2.5 ounces, will cause hypovolemic shock and potentially a heart attack because the heart always needs some back pressure to function against. That's what triggers it. Its own back pressure. It's pressure, less pressure, but never no pressure because that will stop the heart. So I've been involved in several death cases in which the child bled out. And a modern baby diaper is treated with a special chemical that pulls in moisture and hides it inside the diaper. So a young parent who was unaware of that might be told by the doctor to peek in the diaper and make sure it's not that the boy isn't bleeding. But they can look inside and see nothing because those little tiny droplets are working their way into the fabric of the diaper and they don't show up on the outside. I've done this demo in lectures. And so the child will have a heart attack before morning because he doesn't have enough blood for his heart to work against pressure. And it's called hypovolemic shock. And it's an easy way for the child to die because they just go into a very, very deep sleep. They don't complain. They don't scream and yell, and the mother comes and sees them and takes care of them. So they're just found dead in the morning. We estimate that this happens perhaps a couple hundred times a year, but it's wildly covered up by the medical community because circumcision isn't considered terribly difficult. In fact, it's considered something that a new medical graduate who's never done any surgery on anybody can do for practice. So we've always contended that hospital circumcisions are the safest. I mean, I'm not boosting them or hoping you'll get one, but hospital circumcisions are the safest because at least there are night nurses on duty who know what they're doing and can look inside and see. Except we just had a case in New York Hospital, where a boy was pulled out of the neonatal intensive care unit, the NICU, for circumcision at 11 o'clock at night. Not because it was therapeutic for the child, but it was probably just lucrative for the person who did it, who happened, by the way, to be, as I remember, a nurse practitioner, not a physician. And so the child was circumcised at 11, left alone, discovered to be bleeding at 4 a.m., and God knows how much he had bled out. The nurse reported it. The doctor didn't come in until 7. By the time they came in at 7, he already had a massive blood loss. And they're being very quiet about it because the child is now only, 6 months old? But I'm sure he has massive brain damage because what happens, even if you can be rescued from hypovolemic shock, is your brain has been deprived of the blood it needed, and now you have some highly necrotic tissue or tissue death in very important parts of the body. So this poor child is going to be massively, massively disadvantaged for his entire life. And all for what? Oddly enough, I think his family runs some kind of medical establishment, some sort of a small HMO. I really don't know because the details are hard to come by, but I remember it was a national scandal at the time. Now, compare that to outpatient circumcisions, which are a glowing trend. That is, the hospital doesn't do the circumcision at birth, but a week or so later, somebody does it at a family practice clinic or a pediatrician's office or even a pediatric urologist's office. And the problem is the child is circumcised and then immediately handed off to the parents to be taken home. And that puts the child at terrific risk of that loss of only 2 ounces of blood, easily hidden in an infant diaper, easily hidden. And yeah, those children are at tremendous risk everywhere. It's not a lucrative enough procedure to keep the child overnight in the clinic office. They probably don't even have any sort of facilities for that. So it becomes a dangerous day surgery in that regard.
So what you're getting in, based off what I've also read in the packet that you sent me and some of your other videos, is that there is zero regulation with this practice at all. There's no circumcision specialist at all, and many of the boys are not even anesthetized. They're not given any pain-reducing medication or anything like that, correct?
Yeah, only 25% of cases does the child, this is a study, a recent study, only 25% of the kids get anything in the way of anesthesia or analgesia, pain medicine. And the 25% who do get something get an ointment called EMLA, which stands for eutectic mixture of local anesthesia. And EMLA is kind of like a numbing agent, but it takes a long time to soak into skin, but nobody ever bothers to wait the time needed for it to soak in. Also, it can't cross a barrier. And remember, the foreskin is a double fold of tissue. It's folded onto itself. And so EMLA can't penetrate into the second layer. It can only penetrate to the top layer if it's even given the time to do that. So, I mean, you can fairly say that virtually no child ever gets a properly anesthetized circumcision of the kind an adult would want if an adult requested it. So, yeah, and that has an effect. There have been studies showing that you can tell that a child was circumcised by his exaggerated reaction to any kind of immunization 6 months or a year later. And the researchers in one of the cases or one of the studies I'm thinking of called that a infant analog to post-traumatic stress disorder. So it does have a psychological effect. I mean, most men probably, in fairness, probably can't recall their circumcision, although some do. And so that's thought, well, who cares? So, and children have always been, because they can't advocate for themselves and they're not paying the bill, their comfort is not much of an issue for medical people. I mean, children are thought to cry anyway. So, I mean, that's what they say. I've heard this 100 times from nurses and doctors. Well, the child's going to cry anyway, so why bother? I mean, give him anesthesia, he'll cry about the anesthesia. He'll cry because he's cold. He'll cry because it's the room lights are right in his eyes. There's all kinds of reasons why children cry, mostly because they're uncomfortable. And so if they're going to cry anyway, who cares? That's part of it. But remember, you can't really expect a highly ethical construct from a surgery whose history was originally a punishment. The Jews circumcised their enemies as a punishment. They circumcised their servants to mark them as servants. Historically, circumcising a male has always been a way to humiliate him. And it's really not much different today. It's just that the marketing is slicker.
What happens to the foreskin after? What do they do with it?
Well, I mean, mostly it's considered medical waste, but it's also sold to or given to or picked up by companies who make women's facial cosmetics. You might consider it ironic that the tissue, which is wrinkly, would be turned into a facial cream meant to get rid of wrinkles. I don't know the mechanism, but apparently because it's fresh tissue that hasn't been polluted by chemicals, that the body hasn't yet decided what it's going to do with it, that the substrates in there, the tissue that's in there that can be grown larger, will be useful for industrial purposes. So yeah, there's a whole industry dealing with foreskins. They're called fibroblasts, if anybody wants to do the research. A fibroblast is a kind of a cell that hasn't yet differentiated and can be used for lots of different purposes, including medical research. So yeah, there's a ready market for that.
So there's a potential that people are literally rubbing baby foreskin on their face as a rejuvenation
Right.
protocol.
And to be fair, there are uses of the foreskin that are ethical. If you get past the notion that you stole it from somebody, the use of it as a artificial skin for burn victims, a replacement for eyelids, all sorts of injuries that could use a tissue of that sort. But you have to get past the idea that you stole that tissue from a boy who wasn't asked whether he wished to keep it or not.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned the Jews doing this to their enemies as a humiliation ritual, and then they have their children, like they celebrate this within their own religion now. No, it's I think it's called a bris, where it's a celebration where the boy gets circumcised.
We only get involved in that tangentially. I mean, there are Jewish organizations that I recommend people go to so they can speak to people of their own faith. Two I can think of are Beyond the Bris, which is a great website. And the other one is Bruchim. It's spelled Bruchim. Bruchim is an organization pushing for intact boys to be welcomed by the rabbi and by their local synagogue, and not needing a circumcision. I mean, Jews used to be very rigorous about it. You couldn't be a member of a community without being circumcised. And Bruchim is pushing for more awareness on the part of parents who often, for instance, are in a mixed marriage. One member is a Jew, the other is not. And so they need to reconcile this issue. And Bruchim is a way of doing that. So yeah. But, as an organization, DOC doesn't spend much time worrying about ritual circumcisions because we believe if there's to be reform about that, it should come from within the communities, within the Jewish faith, within the Muslim faith, within the Coptic Christian faith, because they circumcise too. And I don't comment on it much because 98% of the problem is medical circumcisions. So if I can solve the medical circumcision issue somehow, or if Doc can historically, the Jews would probably come along and create some reform in their own community. I mean, if I were designing Judaism, obviously, I don't know how one designs a religion, but I would think that the way to make circumcision part of the religion is to to have a man understand he's making a genuine sacrifice of his own sexual tissue and have that be the cost of his membership in the community, but maybe have that surgery at age 25 when the man now appreciates what he's giving, and so it's an actual sacrifice. I mean, it has always mystified me intellectually why the child is asked to make a sacrifice when he can't make a sacrifice because he can't consent to it. So clearly, it's only a sacrifice in the sense that somebody owns the child like cattle, and you sacrifice the child, which, of course, Judaism has a history of animal sacrifice. That was part of its origins. But it just seems odd to me to ask the baby to make the sacrifice. I can see asking the father to make the sacrifice, but not the baby. So, but I mean, you need to hire a rabbi to help them explain to you the logic of all that.
This may be a really hard question for you to answer because, as I mentioned earlier, it was just an intuitive thought that this doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me. I don't think we'd be born with the foreskin if we didn't needed it. It clearly serves a purpose as a gland with lubrication and such. But what is the cognitive dissonance? Why is this not kind of setting off light bulbs or red flags for other parents? And what's going through their mind, or is it just
You know,
unconscious?
conformism is a terribly powerful motivation for people. And the notion that, the notion that you buck the culture. I counsel parents all the time who have bucked the culture and who decided, as you did, not to circumcise their children because they just didn't like the feel of it. It just felt odd to cut off healthy tissue from this beautiful little baby without asking his permission. But, cultures have a way of, I tell lecturers, the fish doesn't know about the goldfish doesn't know about the water. The goldfish knows about the goldfish and other fish, but he doesn't realize he's living in water. So Americans don't realize they're living in this circumcision saturated medical system that keeps gently pushing the issue and keeping it alive and saying, "Oh, parents, you have to make a decision." She might start thinking about it. You're only 4 months pregnant, but you think about the future now. Think about the decision you'll have to make. Well, it isn't a decision. It's a marketing ploy to tell people they have to choose. Quick side story: my dad used to represent Evinrude and Johnson Outboard Motors, and he said, John, he said, John, they're the same motor. They just have a different paint job. But one of the tricks is to convince people they need to choose between buying a Johnson and buying an Evinrude. And if you trick people into thinking they have to buy either a Johnson or an Evinrude, you've tricked them into thinking they need an outboard. Do you see what I
Mm,
mean? Because you've given them a choice, it seems like you need to make the choice. So one of the rituals that hospitals engage in is this constant notion that parents have to choose. And
yeah.
and for instance, a recent study showed that the number of times a mother and father at the hospital are solicited for their child's circumcision is 8. 8 times. Now, to me, if somebody asked me 8 times and I said no each time, I would consider myself being harassed, just simply harassed. I would have
Mhm,
thought my early no, or at least the second one or third one, would be entirely adequate, but nope, not in the medical setting. They have to work you until they can get the business.
mhm,
It's lucrative. It's a very quick surgery. It's perfect practice for first or second year residents. Gets them doing surgery, it gets them cutting people and gets them worrying about hemostasis, not bleeding and all these sort of things. So it's a marvelous little setup for the hospital. You can get your butt fired big time in the US if you're a nurse who discourages parents from circumcision. You might have some good luck doing it if you're a doctor and well placed in the hierarchy, but you're not going to get away with it as a nurse. You'll find yourself out in the parking lot real quick.
mm,
And there's plenty of examples of that. And I often have asked myself, it's not that lucrative. We're talking about $1,000 in the world of medicine these days. $1,000 is like coffee money. Um, it's not that big a deal, but somehow the American Academy of Pediatrics brokers this practice, and I think they're so deeply invested in it. I think even their legal department is saying, you're so deeply invested in this, you got to keep pushing it. You can't ever come out and say this is a bad idea. They did actually in 1975, and that only lasted a year or so. The committee soon got taken over by people who were ardent proponents of circumcision.
mm.
Notion that it wasn't therapeutic and didn't do anything when quietly pushed away. So yeah, there's an obsessive quality to this. There's a fanatical, cult-like quality to some of what goes on in circumcision. I mean, think about it. I have a friend who jokes that if you're at a cocktail party and want to discuss circumcision, you can clear the room. I think people just don't want to talk about it. They're so deeply invested in it. It happened to them. They did it to somebody. They'd never seen a person who wasn't circumcised, ever. And they've been told that penises that aren't circumcised are ugly looking. And so the only kind of penis you want to see is one with the little fireman's hat at the end poking out. And so it's 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 a taboo. Marilyn Milos, who is was famously the mother of the intactivist movement, says she calls it the great silence. Nobody wants to talk about it. And I have an attorney friend who runs another agency like mine, uh, opposing circumcision. And when she and I get together at medical conferences, we joke that we can get to the topic of circumcision from anything you say to us in 2 steps, which is a great game to play when you're bored in a booth at a medical convention. We are saturated. This is the water around the goldfish. We are saturated in it. In countries like Australia and Canada, the practice has been so well tamped down that it's no longer quite the taboo. It's no longer quite the cult practice. And also, these are countries that have single payer arrangements for healthcare. So they don't have a medical marketplace. People talk about the US having a medical system. We do not have a medical system. We have a medical marketplace. I mean, a hospital is just like a hardware store. It has to sell stuff. And a doctor's office is just like a hardware store. They have to sell stuff and they got stuff to sell. And so, as long as you have a marketplace and nobody's really worried about what you're doing, then I guess circumcision has found a fertile ground.
Mhm.
New Zealand's unusual in that it completely turned its back on the practice. I'm very proud of that fact, by the way, as a born Kiwi with a New Zealand passport, and I voted for Jacinda Ardern in the last election, although she abandoned me eventually. I have proctored a lot of papers over the years. People write me and they say, um, I'm interested in the issue. Do you think you could suggest a topic for a paper? And I go, what discipline? And any discipline. I don't care what it is. You can find a way to do a circumcision paper. It was very common for history students, uh, pre-med, students who wish to do something on bioethics or, yeah, that kind of stuff. Interesting. Fascinating topic.
With the hospitalization, that was pretty much our experience where we were trying to be like upsold. Our firstborn, we were going for a home birth. We got transferred to the hospital and I had to watch him like a hawk. We were being offered this, that. We declined everything. But as you stated it felt like we were being harassed, especially at like odd hours of the night. Our second born was born at home. My wife's a doula, so she experiences like free births, home births frequently throughout the year. And it just like you said, like it seems like they're just trying to upsell you on this, that. So when you're in that environment, just as the fish doesn't know what the water is, it's like trying to sell you on stuff that you may not need. And women are in a vulnerable state. So how are you really going to
Right.
make the best decisions there, especially when you're being bombarded over and over and over again? And with the party, or you're saying like if you can clear out a party if you bring up the topic of circumcision, do you think part of that, as you did as a kid, where you buried it, is just because it's so painful of an experience that people avoid it? They don't want to go there.
I don't know. I have virtually no psychology training except, sort of on the job stuff. But I suspect there's an aspect of it. Yeah. I mean, a man doesn't want to think about the loss he has sustained. A woman doesn't want to think about her husband as having a loss, or being underconfident. I mean, confidence is part of sexual performance, after all, if you're not confident. And so the men that are the least supportive of Doc tend to be circumcised men, the least supportive. The most supportive of Doc tend to be men who are intact and the women they're married to and gay men. I have several gay brothers, and I can say, I think I can cheerfully say that they've done the field work. And so they tend to be against circumcision too. And yeah, but selling the idea to the American public, I mean, I would have thought when I first started reading about this heavily 30 years ago, I would have thought that if men knew what was sitting around in medical books on the subject of their own penis, they would march to the nearest hospital with torches and pitchforks as a giant mob that could not be ignored. But it has never happened. People just seem to take it. They just, you know, I was circumcised. You're my new boy. You're as strong as me. You can handle it. You can look just like me. So there's a bit of that. And there's often women who say, I didn't have a strong opinion on it, but my husband was circumcised and he absolutely insisted that he didn't want to have an intact son. He wanted to circumcise his son. And that's very common. It's part of the pernicious aspects of the marketing here, the Stockholm syndrome aspect, the idea that you eventually adjust to your injury and then want to inflict that same injury on somebody else.
Mm-hmm.
You are
That's what it sounds
quite
like.
rare. You are quite rare. Most men suffer from what's called the Adamant father syndrome, where they want the boy to look like them. And it's the rare man who confronts his loss and says, "Well, heck, I'm not going to do that to my son." It is the rare man. My compliments to you on that, for sure.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I've been through a lot, and I definitely want my child to have a different life than I did myself. But in reality, though, since you brought that up, if maybe I'm naive to this, my son sees me when he's older. He can already talk, but does that conversation ever actually happen? Where it's like, Daddy, why do I look different than you? From your experience,
Well, I've heard it. I've heard it anecdotally. My dad was intact, and I have an intact brother. I have a bunch of non-intact brothers as well. I can't ever remember wondering about Dad's penis. He was very private. He didn't get to see it very often anyway. But yeah, I don't think people spend a lot of time doing that. I think that's part of the mythology, that somehow people are always wandering around comparing.
it seems like it's like, when would that conversation actually even come up? Would the kid even care? Are they self-conscious about it? It seems like it's the flip side, where the male that's been circumcised is the one that's self-conscious and perhaps they want to carry on that pain, the adamant father, as you stated.
Right. Well,
Mm.
the irony is there was a time when all the fathers were intact. And so the hospital had to use desperate techniques to convince the father that he had been accidentally lost. He didn't get the surgery that he needed as a child. And so now, well, you got that, but you don't want that same loss of surgery to happen to your son, do you? And so, yeah, but now, of course, if all they have to do is say, "Well, but you're circumcised, aren't you, Mr. Smith?" And Mr. Smith says, "Well, yes, matter of fact, I am." "Well, don't you want your son to look like you?" So in other words, no matter what the situation was, they figured out a way to market it. They figured out a way to convince the parent to cut their child. If you think about it, if you just take yourself out of our culture for a second and think about it, it's absolutely bizarre that you would cut the genitalia of any child for any reason. It wasn't highly medical. That wasn't something that the child absolutely urgently needed right now. It's just bizarre. It's crazy human behavior. And yet Americans love to think of themselves as highly logical, scientifically driven, ethically driven, focused on doing the right thing. Yet you come to this issue. I've got a book on medical ethics. I looked in the index when I bought it. It doesn't even have circumcision in the index. In other words, it's not mentioned in this entire book on bioethics and complicated end-of-life issues and complicated beginning-of-life issues and the trolley problem of pushing fat people onto the tracks. None of that stuff is in this ethics book, not a single mention of circumcision. Who can believe it? And it's a medical book. It's a book on bioethics. I would like to have seen at least one chapter that did the impossible job of justifying circumcision on bioethical grounds, because it offends every tenet of the hierarchy of bioethical principles.
So what would be a scenario then where circumcision would be justified, in your opinion, if any?
Well, like any tissue in the body, the tissue can fail for any number of reasons. If your child was highly diabetic, brittle diabetic, and that tissue kept getting ischemic because it wasn't getting enough blood supply, you could perhaps argue for a circumcision in that sense. If the tissue became necrotic because it didn't get blood supply, because you do know of people, don't you, that have lost limbs due to brittle diabetes, where their peripheral circulation was so bad that the tissue became compromised.
Mhm.
So, yeah, that's or cancer, but 8-day-olds and 1-day-olds don't get cancer. So yeah, it'd have to be pretty drastic to convince me that it was necessary.
Mhm.
I get calls all the time from men who are scheduled for a circumcision because they have something called phimosis. Phimosis just means that the foreskin has kind of closed around the glands and can't easily be opened. And of course, people worry. They want to be clean in there and they want to see the glands and all that kind of stuff. So they worry about it. Well, it actually isn't a problem. It's vaguely associated with problems later in life, but it isn't a problem and it's easily solved. With stretching exercises, beta-methasomes, semi-potent steroids, or a combination of stretching and semi-potent steroids, and most of those phimosis cases can be solved. But go to a adult urologist, and the only thing he or she will say is, well, you need a circumcision. We'll schedule you for next week. And because they don't want to do anything, even though there's also a really handy surgery called, what the heck is it called? It's a prosthetic. It's a slit through the foreskin that is closed the other way. It's slit longitudinally and closed laterally, which exchanges some length for some width. It's a plastic surgeon's technique. It's easily done. You can find it. You can look it up in Wikipedia, and there's even diagrams there. But I can't get anybody to do it. I mean, I have asked medical schools and urology practices all over the country, and they say, no, we don't do that, but we will do a circumcision happily. But they won't do this particular very simple preputioplasty. That's the word I was looking for.
Mm.
It's called preputioplasty. In other words, fixing the foreskin. And
Hmm.
I just can't find it. It's not taught. Our local medical school here doesn't teach it. So hard to know. I don't know why.
Since you brought up like the cleaning and such, and people wanting to get in there, forcibly retracting the foreskin and such, there was a time. Hopefully, my son doesn't hate me for admitting this later on in life, but there was a day when he had case of balanitis, which I guess would be the inflammation. And admittedly, as a parent, especially being circumcised myself, I don't know. I've never dealt with this before, but it was scary seeing a little bit of inflammation around that area, and I didn't know what to do. We cleaned it. We didn't forcibly retract it. I knew not to do that. But how would a parent care for their uncircumcised child then? What would be the standard of care, if any?
Well, you have to ask yourself how the child got balanitis in the first instance. The foreskin is like an eyelid. In fact, I use that example all the time. It's like an eyelid. It has its own immune active substances, heavy proteins that protect against incoming bacteria or pathogens of any kind. And so the foreskin is really rather low maintenance. And if you think about it, that makes sense, right? Because we didn't come from 100,000 years ago constantly washing our genitalia. It just didn't happen. People weren't bathing that much anyway. I mean, men who shower every day and pull their foreskin back and scrub their glands are doing themselves a terrible disservice because they're getting rid of natural immune active substances that prevent conditions like balanitis. So I would wonder how a child managed to get balanitis. I can't imagine, but I could see that it could happen. And I would hope you could either write it out because bodies can deal with that. Boys, for instance, get urinary tract infections that are subclinical. They won't even notice them themselves, except maybe they're a little itchy, and it'll come and go. But take them to the doctor on the day when they have that, and they'll do a, a test to show that there's bacteria there. But that doesn't mean anything because that bacteria could be gone in a month. The body could have taken care of it.
Mm.
I ask people in lectures, I say, did you shampoo your eyes this morning? And they laugh, of course. And I say, but have you ever shampooed your eyes? And the answer is, we never shampoo our eyes. How does that work? Well, they have very strong protections because there are two holes in your head. And you would think, well, geez, bacteria could get in there and just keep going. And the answer is, well, probably not, or none of us would be here. We are the people who survived, whose eyes developed immune active substances to protect us. We may have had some distant ancestors who didn't have that feature and they died off. So in other words, these are evolutionary ideas that the body protects itself. against incoming infection. A penis can be safely ignored for the boy's entire life. You don't have to do anything to it. Even when he urinates, he's urinating a sterile substance that pushes anything that's in there out. And that's a very useful feature. Apropos of that, I remember my wife chatting with her eye doctor, and he said, well, if you ever run out of saline solution, the stuff you buy at the drugstore for your contact lenses, you could just pee on it. As long as you don't have a disease, urine is perfectly sterile. It doesn't stay sterile, of course. It does eventually decay, but it's sterile as it comes out. So better than saline, better than distilled water. So yeah, the foreskin should, frankly, the whole apparatus should just be left alone. The boy has, if the boy has both his testicles descended at the appropriate time, as long as he can pee a stream, there's really nothing to worry about. There's no poking around. I've got 3 or 4 complaints against physicians rolling right now. I used to send the parents materials that they could share with their doctor to help him or her. Well, that never seemed to work. So now I bring a formal complaint against anybody who has forcibly retracted a boy with their medical society. And I currently have one in West Virginia and one in Florida, and one in Iowa, one in Oregon. And these cases are hotly contested because there's this real tendency in American medicine to goof with boys' penises. There are billing codes for it, which makes it handy that you get paid for goofing with the penis. But, in Europe, they don't do this stuff. They just let the boy have his penis. It's self-managing.
The balanitis that we experienced, it went away like pretty much the very next day. So thankfully that happened. But I'm sure you've gotten cases where parents may panic in that situation and then they take their child into the doctor's office. Perhaps they play with it, they forcibly retract it, and now they're offering, oh, we should just circumcise what you hear. And I'm sure that.
Oh, exactly.
Well,
one of the reasons why forcible, I always call forcible foreskin retraction the doppelganger of circumcision. It's the evil twin. It's if you can get that going, you can probably figure out a way to sell the parents a circumcision. Most of the infections that boys get on their penises are from other people goofing around. Now, admittedly, a boy can be touching his anus and his foreskin in the same transaction, as kids will goof around with themselves and maybe cause an infection that requires antibiotics. But other than that, penises are pretty low maintenance. It's just not that big a deal. I don't understand all the concerns, but you just can't, like, the most dangerous time here. I have an article. This is from Psychology Today. It's an article I wrote many, many years ago, and it's entitled, if you can't see it, "What is the greatest danger for an uncircumcised boy?" And the answer is real simple: a well baby visit. That's when they get retracted. That's when they get an infection. That's when they end up at the pediatric urologist's office. So, yeah, too much goofing around with penises. Not enough respecting the human body as a highly evolved mechanism that has defenses of its own that can be relied on mostly.
she said earlier that we can also restore the foreskin. So what extent and would men get their sensation back with that? How well does it work?
Well, it can protect what you have for a start against more keratinization. One of the nicest, I tried restoration many, many years ago. I'm not very disciplined about it, and I'd never really finished, but I did a pretty good job. And what happens is that you produce enough skin that it covers the corona of the glands, and that keeps it more sensitive because it doesn't get all dried out and crusty. It has its original sensation because the penis, after all, is an internal organ of the body. It's able to poke out when it needs to, but otherwise it's kept inside its cover, which is brilliant design, as I mentioned earlier. And yeah, so men find that even a few months of restoration can cause their foreskin to stick over the top of the corona and keep the corona nice and wet. And then if it gets longer, it'll do the same thing to the glands. The glands doesn't have a lot of useful sensation, but it is part of the program, and if it can be kept moist, it does help somewhat. So yeah, you can't get back the frenulum delta, You're stuck with your shortened frenulum, but you can at least protect it from more keratinization, more drying historically, and improve the sensation. And also you're improving the mobility of the skin on the penis, so you get rid of things like tight nocturnal erections. But people don't realize that men have 2 or 3 erections a day that are unbidden, that they didn't induce and don't necessarily want, typically during deep sleep. And we don't even know why the body does that. Something about reoxygenating the blood in the area. Who knows? But you have many more erections in your life than you ever needed sexually. I mean, you're having what, 3 a night, so that's like 21 erections a week, right?
Right.
But you only need a couple for sexual purposes. The rest of them are basically the body dealing with itself. And so if you have had an aggressive circumcision, that skin can be so drum tight that it wakes you up. And I get complaints from like that from men all the time, that they have drum tight skin on erection. And one of the ways men can test whether they're aggressively circumcised is pull their glands out with one hand and then pull the scrotum forward with the other. And if the scrotum goes right to the glands, you have what's called a winged penis. That's because you don't have as much skin on your penis, and so it needs the scrotum to cover itself. So yeah, guys who have winged penises or winged scrotums uh, or show signs of an aggressive circumcision. The Gomco clamp and the Plastabel, and the other clamps the clamps were invented to ablate as much erogenous tissue as possible. That was the point. And so the modern circumcision is far more brutal than the historical one where they just pulled the foreskin out and it clipped off what they could. The modern foreskin clamp goes right underneath and creates a scar line right near the glans corona. And so basically there's not much left of the erogenous tissue on the penis. I, I
Mm.
here's something we do in lecture that anybody can do who's watching right now. Rub your right hand over your left hand of the top of your left hand and gauge the sensitivity of that skin. Now flip over your hand and do that same technique to your palm. There's a fantastic difference, noticeable, much more likely to tickle you or to be noticed. That's Meissner's corpuscles. Those are what the foreskin is loaded with. It's it tells you spatially where things are. The most sensitive parts of the human body are the lips, the eyes, the fingertips, and the genitalia. The rest of it is pretty normal skin sensation, but not highly sensitive. I mean, the reason an elephant can pick up a dime is he probably has Meissner corpuscles too. And the reason we can sort coins in our pocket and know which is a dime and which is a quarter and which is a penny is because we have these Meissner's corpuscles. That's what circumcised men are missing.
Mm. I mean, it makes sense. Based off my studies, I'm a coach, dealing with like kinesiology and neurology. Your extremities, your hands and your feet, those are what you interact with the environment with. So those are going to be the most
Right.
sensitive areas. And then if you have a penis, like that's also an extension. It would only make sense that that's how you interact with the world. So you need that sensation there. It only makes
Right.
sense.
Yeah, absolutely. And the other thing is that we don't even know what the biome is of human penis. Nobody has really studied what what's being transferred between partners in the way of substances, useful substances, substances that make you feel good. We also don't know what that touch sensation does to the brain. I mean, we're only just beginning to understand the science of touch, of how important it is, why a baby who lacks the touch of the mother will not thrive. I mean, these are important aspects of human physiology. But you can't get a PhD in America doing studies that prove the penis is sensitive. Nobody wants to hear about it. Let me read your listeners a little section I brought from a new medical article just out. It's a Spanish article in translation, but let me read a real key part of their very long study. And this is published in where is it published in? Oh, it's in the online library of Wiley, so easy to find. The human penis functions as a sophisticated sensory organ for sexual stimuli, transmitting signals to spinal centers that mediate sexual reflexes and to supraspinal sites responsible for the subjective experience of sexual sensation. Although erogenous zones exist throughout the entire body, the penis is the primary peripheral organ for sexual sensation in individuals because of its specialized structure, including unique nerve fiber types, corpuscular receptors, and central connections that integrate sensory input with arousal and reflex pathways. Well, that's a bit heavy into the medical jargon, but here's the key phrase. The frenular delta, which is part of the ventral lower prepuce, along with the rest of the prepuce and the glands, are the primary erogenous zones of the penis, containing dense neural structures essential for the perception of sexual pleasure. They just said it straight out, right? That if you cut that off, you have cut off the penis's highly sensitive structure and completely changed its character for that man's lifetime. So this isn't a whimsical choice. I wish I had a buck for every clinical website across the country that says that circumcision is sexually neutral and will make no difference to a man's enjoyment of his body as his lifetime. It is just the most astonishing, outright, direct, in-your-face lie of any I can think of. Astonishing. And I wish I had a buck for every medical book that I found in the University of Washington Medical School Library that claims the glans was the primary sensory organ of the penis, since we know it is not. It's amazing. I mean, what's more amazing to me is the guys who invented this in the 19th century were intact men. They knew what they had, and they knew what their target was. They knew what to go for on the boy to get rid of that sensation. And they were very proud of their work. It's all published. It's all out there. You can go to the medical library, look it up, and read it. It's still there. 19th century stuff, but bit wordy for modern, but it's all there, all the proof of what's going on. And yet we still do it to 1 million boys a year. It's amazing. 1 million of them get circumcised.
I don't know many people that would say that they don't want to have better sex. So it's baffling overall. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense.
Yeah. Who wants to have less penis or less sexual sensation? I mean, you can have conversations with men who have premature ejaculation problems. Admittedly, it is a nuisance, I suppose, especially if you're trying to have children. But gee whiz, to give you a circumcision to desensitize your penis because you have premature ejaculation problems in your 20s, what does that say about what you're going to feel and appreciate and understand in your 30s and 40s and 50s and 60s and 70s and 80s? I mean, admittedly, at a certain age, I don't think nature intended you to reproduce, and probably nature didn't intend you to enjoy sexuality as much as you might want. But in fairness, I think men should be left with the sensation they have and not have it be compromised.
Mm.
Go ahead.
You touched on the last question that I wanted to actually ask you before seeing how people could work with you. How many intact men do you know at an older age are actually coming in for circumcision then?
Well, I mean, the theory is just like what, 1 in 1,000? I mean, once a man has a foreskin and understands how it works, he doesn't give it up very voluntarily. There are circumcisions of men in rest homes because the staff don't know how to take care of a man who is very old and unable to attend to his personal hygiene. They don't know that they could just pull back the foreskin and rinse it off with plain water and probably avoid all the problems. So men do get circumcised in rest homes if they weren't circumcised as children and if they have any kind of penile problem, because the rest home assisted living place doesn't really want to deal with the day-to-day hygiene of that issue. They would rather have a one-stop solution.
Mm-hmm.
Of course,
absolutely.
There'll always be an adult urologist nearby who's happy to oblige.
Well, John, I really appreciate all of your knowledge, your wisdom, brother, and what you're fighting for. I believe that you are on the right path, and I totally agree that this practice is not really necessary at all, clearly, as I have the 2 boys that are uncircumcised. How would people be able to find you, your work, your information, some of the articles that you've done, and how would they be able to work with you personally if
Well, I think
necessary?
all you have to do is type in doctors opposing. I think we're the only organization that has that particular short phrase, doctors opposing circumcision. My personal phone number has been on the website for decades. I get calls all the time. I mean, I sort of run, you wouldn't call it a hotline. It's more like a warm line because I have to sleep, but it's on 16 hours a day and I answer questions all the time. Men call up, give me a fake name and tell me a long, tearful story. And that's some of what I do. And parents call up whose child was injured. Attorneys call up who are conducting litigation, etc. So we're readily available. Our website is, we worked very hard at this website to make sure that it was nice and even and not shrill and not constantly screaming out, and making threats. It's as chaste and as well documented as we could manage. I mean, and we have a viewpoint, of course, it. We are opposed to non-therapeutic genital cutting on children, male, female, transgender, intersex, all of it. We're opposed to it unless it's absolutely therapeutic, not just cultural or whimsical. And so we have various essays in there for parents. There's a whole section in there on warning parents about forced retraction injuries and how you can prevent that. I send, whoops, I didn't bring it. We send parents stickers or artwork for stickers they can put on their child's diaper or nappy that says, "I'm intact, don't retract, doctor's opposing circumcision."
Mm.
Starts the conversation. So if you have an intact boy, the pediatrician or the nurse practitioner will forcibly retract the boy. At least you have a conversation about it. You've forbidden the practice, so hopefully it won't happen. Although I wish I had a buck for every case I've handled where the parent forbade the retraction of the child and the child was retracted anyway. Go figure. It's just so deeply embedded that it's what happens.
It's like
But
automatic.
yeah, just go to doctors opposing circumcision. It's all there. And my phone number's there and all the inquiry um, correspondence that we get, people write for any number of reasons. But those all come to me. I mean, and I have people who will help me with the questions if it's a difficult one. But mostly it's me uh, staffing that particular line. I get calls at 5 in the morning from the East Coast. You can imagine how uncheery that is out here on the West Coast, getting a call at 5
Mhm.
a.m.
Yeah.
But
No, perfect. I'm glad you put that stuff together because as a new parent, if you haven't done your research, which happens, you don't know of these things. So you could show up to the wellness visit and they perform this without your knowledge. You don't even know that you can decline. A lot of people don't even know a lot of the stuff in the hospital,
right.
even if you gave birth in the hospital, that you can decline all of these procedures. So
Well,
that's really valuable.
it's pretty easy to intimidate 25-year-old parents or even 30-year-old parents. So, the system relies on that. So
Yep.
yeah, it's helpful to go to the well baby visit well armed against this particular pernicious practice. I need to mention two things. One is we talked about the Jewish situation. If people call me up, I refer them to Bruchim, but I also mentioned that there is a procedure called Bris Shalom, which means a covenant of peace. And we highly recommend that. So if when Jewish parents call us up, we say, well, check on Bris Shalom, go to Bruchim and go to Beyond the Bris and see what's out there for a way of a welcome ceremony that honors the very long history of Jewish history and honors the sentiments behind some of the things of Jewish history and yet still respects the child's autonomy. So that's important. The other thing is, I think I mentioned I counsel men who are doing restoring, more in the way of cheerleading for them than giving them the actual practical. There are tons of excellent websites on foreskin restoration. There are lots of commercial devices that are available, and men just usually romp through a selection of devices and a selection of methods till they find one that they're comfortable with. The occasional case I get is of the circumcised man who has intact boys who wants to look like his boys. Which is why I encourage um, circumcised fathers to engage in foreskin restoration. it's sort of a marvelous thing because it'll take you 2-3 years, but when you're done, you'll look pretty much like your sons. It's just very cool. And I think that even they will appreciate the symmetry of that, if you will, in some ways. Certainly when they get to be teenagers, they will.
That
So
matches
yes,
my
welcome
journey.
callers. Welcome writers. Welcome anybody who connects with us. We'd love to have more connection with the medical community so we can get to medical students before they get infected by this process, before they cross over to the dark side. But that turns out to be our most difficult challenge.
Hmm.
One more website people might check on. It's called Your Whole Baby. WHOLE, Your Whole Baby. I'm on their board of directors. They do an excellent job of what they do. And they keep a list of foreskin-friendly providers. So if you have a toddler who's intact and you want to lower the risk of forced retraction and lower any pressure to have the child circumcised, they have a list state by state of physicians and nurses and other practitioners that parents have recommended. Worth doing.
That's awesome. Awesome. Thank you so much for those resources, John. And as you were saying that, my head I had to be like worrying my head. It's like, yeah, maybe I'll go about the restoration myself and see how that goes and reach out to you if I need a cheerleader myself. So I'm glad you brought that one up too. But yeah, thank you for all your resources, brother. Thank you for your fight. Thank you for your time. I really enjoyed this one, and hopefully it helps out the parents that are a little bit less informed.
Take the whole baby home. Don't leave anything behind.
That's it. Keep it simple.
Okay. Bye.